Hey everyone, just back with another lecture video on South American realm. So I'm a terrible instructor because I've told you like every time I've done one of these that I'm trying to make it shorter and I never do. So I am going to do better this time because I'm going to run through this pretty quickly because I do have another video similar to the last chapter that I did with the Mexico trip that I did. So I had a trip to Peru last May, and I have an accompanying video that's embedded in your lesson and in your homework assignment for this chapter. So I'm going to make this video a lot shorter to compensate for that. So some of these countries, some of these slides, I'm just going to kind of script through and run through, and I'm just kind of share some highlights for y'all that kind of offer a different perspective than maybe what the textbook says, or some of the changes that have happened actually since this textbook was written, because actually a lot's changed in this realm since then. So the South American realm, again, we're moving to South America. This realm coincides with a continent. It's South American continent, so it's all kind of one deal. It's not split like some of the other realms are. And up here you can see the Isthmus, Central America. If you remember our last lesson, we've got Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama. The Caribbean Sea is right up here, and then this is South America. So if you remember the Panama Canal, United States would be up in here. The Panama Canal allows ships to go from the United States down through Panama Canal to get over here to the Pacific Ocean. If we didn't have that canal, they would have to go all the way around down here around the tip of South America and back up, which is numerous days, extra days of sailing. So the Panama Canal really cut down on that time with the shipping lanes. So you can see here, this is kind of a topographic map. I'm going to show you a better one in here in a few slides and talk about some of the primary physical geography of South America, or physiographies, and they're the same thing basically. So the two predominant things that you're going to see in South America are the Andes Mountains, which begin up here and run north-south, basically all the way down through here, almost to the tip of South America down here. Of course, they get a little bit less down here, but they still keep going almost down here. If you've ever heard of the clothing line Patagonia, this region down here at the tip of South America, that's Patagonia. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it's from there. They just took the name, but that's called Patagonia down here on the very tip of South America. So what you're going to see in South America, a lot of indigenous people and mestizos like we had in Middle America. You have primarily Spanish and Portuguese, Latinos. Remember that term, Latin America? This is going to be more predominant here. There are a little bit of influence in the very northern part along the Caribbean of British, French, and I think maybe the Netherlands settled one country up there. But it has a pretty modern political landscape, a little bit better than Central America and the Caribbean does, but it's still not entirely stable in most of these countries. Some countries, Chile for instance, has been up and down. It's relatively stable now. Argentina has historically been a pretty stable country. Brazil more or less has been, although recently we've had a few upsets. And Peru has been up and down, and right now it's in a downturn. And that's happened since my trip there. And I'll talk about that more here in just a few minutes. So again, here's your concepts, ideas, and terms. You need to know these. So here's a little bit better physiographic map or physical map of South America. This is actually from Google Earth. So you can see here is the Amazon basin, the big green area here. You've got the Andes Mountains coming down here. Now one important thing, and I do mention this in the other PowerPoint that I do, the other video on my trip to Peru, is the weather patterns here. Our weather patterns here in continental United States come from the west to the east. So they come from basically California or sometimes the southwest toward Mexico or Texas, and they move east to northeast typically. Now down here's the opposite. We go south of the equator and we're in a different convergence zone here. So the weather comes from east to west, so it's going this way. So remember, there's going to be a term, we've mentioned it already, we're going to talk about it a little bit more in this lesson, the rain shadow effect, which means the weather's blowing in this way, and then you've got this very, very tall mountain chain here. And you can see a stark difference in the vegetation in this mountain chain. So that weather hits this mountain chain, is blown up, and it dumps all of its precipitation on this side of the mountains. Goes over, the air becomes warmer. It cools as it goes up. It drops moisture. It comes down the back side. All the moisture has been tapped out of it. So the back side of these mountains, the west coast of South America, from basically the southern coast or border of Ecuador and northern border of Peru, all the way down to the probably central Chile, that's some of the driest desert you'll find in the world, especially in this area right here. It's called the Atacama Desert in northern Chile. That is, without a doubt, the driest place in the world. So you have a lot of desert area on the west coast, something that you might not expect if you do ever travel to Lima, Peru, for instance. As Americans, we typically think of, tropical stuff when we go to Latin America. That's not the case down here on the west coast. Now, once you go over that continental divide, where it breaks from the western side of the mountains to the eastern side and start down, then you start entering the cloud forest and eventually the rainforest of the Amazon basin. The Amazon River has its origins in the southern part of the basin in Peru. So, kind of an interesting fact that you might not have known before. So, some of the explorers, these are in your textbook. I'm not going to spend much time on these. This is called an elongated rim because it's longer from north to south than it is east to west. It definitely has a elongated structure from north to south. I've already talked about the different climates. You got various different climates because of the altitude, the latitude, which means how far north and south you go. Now remember, the equator is up here. So you've got the equator, and typically it's pretty hot at the equator, right? So as you go south or north, the further you get from the equator, the closer you get to the poles, you get a more temperate and eventually a colder climate. So again, South America is very elongated. So as you go south away from the equator, you get down here into Argentina and Chile, you get more temperate and even cold climates at the southern tip of these countries. Add to that the mountain chains. So I did a hike. You'll see in the slideshow the other one in Peru. We hiked up to 17,000 feet in one mountain. And you look around, and we're not too far from the equator. I mean, we're relatively close distance, and you've got ice and snow on top of these mountains. So that tells you how high these mountains are, and that gets into that other thing that we talked about in Middle America, that altitudinal zonation, with regards to the changing climate as you go higher and higher in altitude, thus different crops, different lifestyles. So we're going to talk a lot about Incas in this. This is their indigenous dominant culture from historical pre-settlement, pre-Spanish and Portuguese settlement. They primarily were in this area over here in the Andes. They did venture out from the Andes and some of these basins into the coast. So they weren't only in the mountains, but that was their kind of, you can think of the Andes as kind of the spine of their region. And they kind of went from up here in Colombia all the way down to probably central Chile and Argentina, somewhere in there. And again, you've got other cultures that kind of blended with them, so it's kind of fuzzy on exactly where the borders are with the Inca, but the core of it was in southern Peru and Bolivia. Machu Picchu, as I talk about extensively in that other video, that was close to the center. Cusco, the city there, was close to the center of their empire when it was there. There's a pretty rigid class structure in South America. Most people live in urban centers, and as I talked about in Middle America, there's a class structure based on urban versus rural, and then how much of a certain kind of blood you might have in you. the indigenous people are looked down upon, like I said, by the more urban people. Um, and that's how that hierarchy goes in these countries typically. So, of course, you know the Spanish, the conquest. Anytime colonization happens, it happened here in North America with the Native Americans, in Middle America with the Spanish and British and French and Portuguese, and South America was no different. They came here. Now, North America was a bit different because you had a lot of the British people, the English people that came over. They were actually fleeing persecution and trying to start new lives. So it's a little bit different scope. The Spanish and the Portuguese, they pretty much are coming over to just take resources. They were looking for riches, gold, silver, precious metals. They just wanted to exacerbate those resources and send it back to their home countries. So Lima was the capital of the Spanish conquest of South America. The Portuguese had Brazil. So if you know anything about Brazil today, they speak Portuguese. It's the biggest country in South America, and it's a Portuguese settlement. Most of the other significant countries are Spanish. The only exceptions are your Guyanas up here, and we're going to talk about them in just a few minutes. So a lot of these countries, even though they're kind of have common borders, they're really pretty isolated from each other because of the urban kind of setup where most of the people live in these cities. And you can see from that map before and even on this map the vast distances between these big cities. I mean, pretty much the interior of the country doesn't have much at all. The continent, I'm sorry, doesn't have much of at all. You've got the Amazon basin, which, as you know, is not heavily populated, and you've got the Andes Mountains, which are not heavily populated. You've got to go to the coasts to find the big cities, or at least near the coast. So even though the countries have common boundaries, the actual populations are pretty separated from one another. So this is a population distribution. You've seen this in our other realms. It just kind of shows you where people live. And again, we're close to the coast, and most of the population that you see here is concentrated along the coasts. And just like anywhere else, most of the indigenous people were eradicated here, including the Incas, including other tribes in South America. You still have large populations of indigenous people there, but 90% of them were wiped out by the conquest of the Spanish and the Portuguese. Let me see. And of course, this is just kind of mentioning that they brought their ideology and her religion. As you know, Latin America, both Middle America and South America, are heavily Catholic. You do see some more African influence on the coast over here. Of course, that's not a coincidence because Africa is just east of here. So you had a vibrant slave trade here like you did in North America and Middle America. So you have more African descendants that you're going to find in these areas along the coast. Interesting fact, in Peru, my wife had never seen a black person living in Peru. You just don't see. There was actually one settlement of people that actually came there. They were not from the slave trade. They probably were ultimately in other parts of South America, but they came to Peru and set up their own community, and it was actually a really, really neat area. Really unique food. It was pretty nice. So you see a lot of mestizos and indigenous people in the central areas. Indigenous, you see here a swath through Peru. If you were to see my wife and her family, they look very indigenous. They look like, and she is from the Andes Mountains originally, so that makes perfect sense. So again, I've already kind of covered that. And internal migrations, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more going forward, more right now than in history, because we're having a couple right now that are happening since my trip there. It's kind of happening. So now let's go to the kind of land use down there. And subsistence agriculture is big, especially in Peru. In that video that you're going to see some examples of that. My wife's family has their their agriculture in their village where she's originally from. They have some livestock. Mind you, this is at their village is about 10,000 feet altitude. So you can imagine their livestock's not near what ours are. If any of our cows here were to go to those mountains in Peru, they would die of a heart attack in probably 5 minutes trying to walk up through there. So the cows are a lot smaller, as are the people. You see, when I go down there, I'm 5'9", and I'm really big when I go down there to the mountain villages because the indigenous people, and this has been studied, the higher altitude you go, you have less oxygen. So people that actually kind of evolved there and have lived there for generations and generations, they have smaller bodies just because they have less oxygen up there. And you see that in animals, you see that in people as well. So again, the subsistence agriculture is predominant in the Andes. When you get into the lowlands, you get different types of agriculture. Of course, your tropical environment down here, you see all this blue, that's the Amazon. They're saying that's agroforestry. I think that's kind. It's clear cutting is what it is. They're basically just ripping the Amazon out right now. And that actually got a little better for a while, but I'll tell you what happened here in just a few minutes when we get more into Brazil. So you're starting to see a little bit more large-scale production in certain areas. Not in the mountainous areas. In Peru, there were a couple of valleys that I saw that had some pretty big farms, and I even saw a few tractors and things like that down there, which here, of course, that's nothing to us. But down there, you don't see much of that. Most things are done by hand down there still. So you're starting to see some bigger industry go down there and start their farming operations. Deforestation is terrible in Brazil. It's really bad in all the countries that have any land in the Amazon basin, but especially in Brazil. And there's two angles to that. You've got deforestation. The trees are being cut either for harvesting the wood, which is really secondary to just clear cutting of the forest to make it farmland, because that's more money and that can sustain people better. And because people are poor and they can just go out and claim a piece of land and cut all the trees down. And when you do that, first of all, that's the biggest rainforest left in the world. And that's affecting the world because of the lost carbon. A rainforest is a carbon sink. It absorbs tremendous amounts of carbon. When you cut it and burn it down, all that goes into the atmosphere. That's that much more greenhouse gases that we have in the atmosphere that's going to accelerate global warming or climate change. It also changes the local climate. You start to get less rain. It starts to get hotter. The soil fertility starts suffering because when you start putting crops on things, of course, we're taking fertility out of the soil and shipping it off with those products, with that food. And it doesn't have that natural regeneration of the plant life to replenish the soils. So it's an all-around bad practice. I'm going to mention cocaine here. I'm not going to get into it in much detail right now. You see the areas that it's grown a lot, and you see Peru is one area. Colombia is the biggest area. I mentioned when we talked about Middle America that Colombia used to be the really bad drug country like Mexico is now. Colombia was that when I was young because of the production of cocaine. It's actually improved significantly since then. It's a lot safer to travel to Colombia. And one thing to keep in mind, though, cocaine is made from a cocoa plant. The cocoa plant is a native plant down there, and it was actually used by the Inca. It's really good for altitude sickness. And even today, when you go to Peru, when you visit Machu Picchu or Cusco, they have coca leaves. They make tea from it. You can chew it, and it helps. It supposedly helps. I didn't really test it that much, but it supposedly helps with altitude sickness. I did taste the tea. It tastes terrible, but they say it works. So I always wondered if I tasted that, if I would come back positive on a drug test. I have no idea about the chemistry of cocaine versus the coca leaf, but they still do grow it down there for those purposes, not just to make it into an illegal drug. So that's something to keep in mind. It's not a big a money-making crop, though, when you do it like that. It's basically sold amongst the locals is all it is. Transportation is kind of sparse down there unless you're around the big cities. If you go anywhere, it takes hours more than it does here to drive. From to drive to Lima to Cusco, if you fly, it's like literally less than an hour. If you drive, it's like 23 hours. It's ridiculous. So that's one thing that hurts South America is their transportation. Most of transporting of goods is done by sea through the ocean, and that's why most of your population is on the coast. Industrial development, I'm not going to talk about this a whole lot. Brazil's the only one that really has a lot to speak of down there. Let's skip through this. I've already kind of mentioned it's mostly a urban population, and even today more and more people go to cities to try to find jobs. There's more jobs in the cities. One thing I do want to mention, barrios and favelas, they're the same thing. The difference is barrios is a Spanish word, and it's in Spanish-speaking South America. Favelas is in Brazil. That's a Portuguese word. And they're the same thing. They're shanty towns. And if you don't know what a shanty town is, when you're in a big city down in South America and Central America as well, and as you leave the city, if you're driving on one of their interstates and you're leaving the city, the people that immigrate there don't really have anywhere to live and don't really have jobs. So they basically, there's not a lot of property ownership down there like we think of it here. So when you get to the edge of town, especially in a place like Lima, that's all desert. I mean, once you leave town, it's just sand. I mean, there's nothing out there. They just start putting up little huts. They build out of wood, cardboard, whatever they can find, and they live in those. And you drive through those for miles and miles when you leave a city sometimes. So that's what those are if you've seen pictures of those. So here's are some of the bigger urban areas. I'm not going to talk about this much. Just kind of look at the three big cities down there: Rio de Janeiro, Bogota, Colombia, and Lima. Lima is a very large city. It would be, if it were in the United States, it would be the third largest city. It's bigger than Chicago. Inequality down there, like I said, I've already described that pretty much. The middle class is growing down there. It's getting a little better than it traditionally has been, but still, it's still for the very few in the urban areas that can secure good jobs, that are able to go to school and get good jobs. And you got to remember too that one thing that you see down there is even what we call good jobs here don't pay much in other countries. Even doctors and stuff don't pay near what they pay here. And that's one thing that, like, in just a personal experience, when my wife came here, she thought, if she knows how much money the average person makes, she's like, that's a lot of money. But they don't realize how much it costs to live here. It costs us so much to live here. They don't have near the expenses that we have here. We have all these insurances, car insurance, house insurance, the rent's higher, or your home prices are higher, everything combined, food price, everything is just so much more expensive here than it is there. Medical cost. The United States is ridiculous on how much it costs us to go to the doctor and get medical treatment. Most other countries in the world is nowhere near what we have to pay here. So the United States, one thing I've realized when I've traveled is in Middle America, everybody kind of wants to come to the United States. They want to be here. South America, they kind of do their own thing. They're not as Americanized as you might think, like Mexico is, or some of Central or Middle America is. They kind of do their own thing in South America. Now, there are people that want to immigrate here. Don't get me wrong that there's not anybody, but it's not like it is closer to here in Middle America. We are getting some Venezuelan immigrants here now, and I'm going to talk about Venezuela here in just a minute, but they've had almost a total collapse of their government, and that's one of the reasons they're trying to get here, just because it's bad down there, not just necessarily because they wanted to come just to the United States. So you can see all of this in your textbook. So one thing to keep in mind too is, and I mentioned this in Middle America, because we're closer, we're in the same hemisphere over here, we've kind of always taken Latin America as a whole for granted. And China is starting to move in on that. You can see here that China has surpassed the U.S. as the largest trade partner with Brazil, Chile, and Peru, and they're making inroads in Central America and Mexico as well. Um, they're just reaching out, and they're just being better business partners than we are right now, and that's just a fact of the global market. And that's something that I think the United States should work on personally. Um, China also needs a lot of raw materials that can be found in South America. So here's your major regions of South America. You got the Caribbean North. Remember the Caribbean, we studied that back in Middle America. That's right here. So you've got Colombia, Venezuela, and the Guyanas here, Suriname, and two Guyanas. I don't know much about those countries. I'm not going to talk about them a whole lot. Then you got Brazil as its own region because it's so large. And then you got the Andean West, which is Peru, Bolivia, and Paraguay is kind of a transition between there and the south, the southern cone, which is Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. So those are your regions of South America. So the Caribbean North, again, I'm not going to go into detail a lot about these. I've already mentioned Colombia. I'm going to mention Venezuela in a couple of slides from now. But these are their Caribbean North. These are the closest to the United States. You can see Panama right there. So that's the Middle American realm. So that's the boundary between the two realms. And this map kind of shows you the largest cities, some of the resources, some of the highlands and mountains. You see Venezuela has some highlands. This is not the Andes. The Andes are over here. But they have some of their own smaller highlands, but highlands nonetheless. A lot of rainforest up here as well near the coast. You also have some kind of grasslands in this area as well, which you don't think about when you think about South America. Colombia, you can read this in your textbook. I'm not going to go through this in detail. This is what I told you earlier about the drug cartels. Back when I was younger, on the most part, they've really stabilized that. There was awful violence there back in the 80s and 90s, and they've really made gains down there. And we helped them out a lot as a country. We sent a lot of resources to the military and their police to help them fight the drug war. We call it that here, and that was part of it, is us helping other countries in their own territories. So it was called the insurgent state because those cartels were considered rebels at the time, and it was basically a revolution between the cartels and the government for several years. And here's a little bit about their rebound. And they're still working with the rebels. They're still out there, but they're not fighting like they were in the past, not nearly as much, if at all, fighting. But they are still there. They're still organized, but they're more negotiating than anything else now. They're still producing cocaine down there. That hasn't stopped, and it probably never will. But it's better. It's a much better situation than it used to be. You can actually travel there now. A lot of people go there for vacations. The Caribbean coast is really nice. The mountains actually are really nice there too. Medellin and Bogota both. Now Venezuela, I'm going to mention a little bit about Venezuela because Venezuela is basically a failed state. It had let me see here. Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998, basically became a leftist dictator. It was essentially a communist country. He died in 2013, but then Maduro took over, and he was basically the same kind of leader as Chavez was. They ran the country to the ground. They actually have a lot of oil reserves down there. They could be a very successful nation if they had any leaders, but it really went downhill, and now you have Venezuelans just piling out of that country. They're immigrating everywhere. When we go to Peru, we see all kinds of people in the street, and my wife tells me those are Venezuelan immigrants that's fled Venezuela because of the violence, and they're just so poor. And again, this is a leftist dictator. We've had plenty of leftist and right dictators in Middle America. The United States has had a tendency in the past to kind of support the right-wing dictators more than the left-wing. That's alienated some of Middle America and South America as well, because we have gotten our fingers dirty a little bit too much in history with some of those conflicts, and some people blame us for the violence. So that's something to keep in mind as well. It's not as bad as it used to be as far as that kind of chip on their shoulder, but and they have a right to have that because we did do some of those things that they accuse us of. So Orinoco is the primary river up here in Venezuela. They're kind of, the southern part is in the Amazon basin, but the northern part's the Orinoco basin. Llanos or savanna grasslands. They have a lot of cattle grazing up there. Here it says 3 million people have fled. That's probably a lot more than it was even when they made this PowerPoint. So Maduro is still in charge down there, but I would say that's going to come apart within the next few years. It can't sustain how it is now. The 3 Guyanas, again, these are the only 3 countries in South America that were settled or colonized by someone other than the Spanish or the French. Or, I'm sorry, the Spanish or the Portuguese. You got French Guyana, you've got a Dutch colony in Suriname, and then you got Guyana, which was a British colony. But they all speak Spanish to my knowledge. French Guyana has a French-speaking population, but I think most of the countries do speak Spanish. Or I know the other 2 do, and I think French Guyana does as well, at least to a point. So the Andean West, you're going to get the whole other lecture, the whole other PowerPoint on that, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. They kind of include Paraguay in here. Again, Paraguay's a transition, kind of like Kentucky is here. Remember, Kentucky's kind of north and south. We're kind of split down the middle. The northwestern part of Paraguay is probably more in the Andean West. The southeastern part, probably more in the southern cone with Argentina or even bordering Brazil there. This is the poorest region of South America. A lot of indigenous people live here in the Andes, all the way up and down through here, the old Inca territory. A lot of people still speak Quechua, which is the native language. Many don't even speak Spanish. So I know a lot of people from where my wife's from speak both Spanish and Quechua. So very indigenous population in these areas. It has a lot of potential with regards to minerals. So here you can see some oil and gas reserves. But remember, oil and gas comes from sedimentary rock. These are high mountains. So these are on the periphery of the mountains. The high mountains are igneous rock, which means you're going to have a lot of heavy metals. You're going to have a lot of gold, silver, and that's what the Spanish were after. So that's why they had their base here in Lima right next to the Andes. And the Inca had a lot of gold. So there's a lot of mining down there. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and I'm going to talk about this. This is the only thing I'm going to talk about with regards to Peru. And that's a little bit the economy and a little bit about the upheaval that's happened recently. So since I've been there, they had a new president elected. And he was in when I was there. And since I was there, they've deposed him and taken him out of office. He was basically a far-left leader. He was a school teacher. He was from the mountains. He got very popular, but he was essentially uneducated and really didn't know a lot about how to run a government. And he was pretty much a failure. I mean, he came in there and didn't know what he was doing, and he tried to dissolve Congress. That didn't work. They took him out. He's in jail now. And you have a very tense situation where the rural population is kind of rising up and protesting against the urban population who didn't want this person in office. So there's been some violence, protests, there's been some deaths. There's not like a rebellion or anything like that, but it's very unstable down there right now. So that's why my wife's actually in Peru right now, and that's why I didn't go down this time, just because it's not really safe for foreigners to go down, and I just didn't want to take a chance, and I had to work anyway, so I had an excuse. But yeah, it's kind of a different situation than it was even when I was down there. So Iquitos, that's the large city that's actually in the Amazon basin. All of this is mountainous. When you get up here in this northeastern corner up here, that's kind of a basin. That's the Amazon basin. That's where Iquitos is. That's where the oil and gas reserves are. So Ecuador is north of Peru, up here. Very similar to Peru. Not as much desert. The mountains kind of chill out a little bit, so it's got more rainforest. You can read about most of this in your textbook. Bolivia is a landlocked country, very poor country. It's going down the same road as Venezuela did with regards to the far left government. They really don't like Americans there right now, and a lot of indigenous population there. So they have a lot of altiplanos, which is kind of high elevation valleys or kind of flat areas up in the mountains. Um, Lake Titicaca is one of the largest lakes at elevation. It's at 12,500 feet. A lot of potatoes and grains are grown in this area. Potatoes actually originated in the Andes Mountains, if you didn't know that. I'm going to run through this. Paraguay, that transitional country I pointed out earlier, is also landlocked. Very poor country. Not a lot of people live there. Kind of a rugged, lawless area. That's not a place you want to really visit, is Paraguay. Now, Uruguay, on the other hand, in the southern cone, is probably one of the premier countries in South America with regards to living there. The lifestyle is more like we live here. Most of the people have good jobs, very educated country. It's a small country, but I've never been there personally, but from everything I've read about it, it's a very good place to live and survive. Then you've got Argentina is a large country, and Chile is a very long country north to south. This is Patagonia down here, but east to west it's very, very thin. So not a really big country volume-wise. I'm going to kind of run through this. Argentina has a lot more farmland than probably most other countries in South America. Has a more temperate climate, a lot of livestock there. Some of the states here, Chile is an elongated state, like we talked about before. And you have the Atacama Desert in the north. I mentioned that earlier. You've got the center area where Santiago is. Probably most of your population is going to live right in this area on the coast. And then you've got southern Chile, which is going to be your more temperate to frigid climates. I've already mentioned that. In Uruguay, I've mentioned that already as well. Brazil, I'm not going to talk a lot about Brazil. I'm going to let you kind of check that out in your textbook and look at these files, these slides on the slideshow. Very large country, very large economy. The only thing I'm going to mention about them is, I've kind of alluded to the rainforest and all that. They actually elected a president about probably 5-6 years ago now. I'm not sure how long their president served for down there. He was, I'll just put it bluntly, he was a big fan of Donald Trump. He was a right-leaning candidate, and he came with the attitude, let's just cut the rainforest down and let's have some farms, let's make some money, and that was his attitude. And environmental progress took a hit when this person came into office. The reason I mentioned he was a big fan of Trump is because they just had basically the same thing happen that we had happen here. He lost the election this past year. When it was time for him to go, his supporters stormed their capital and tried to take it, and they were turned away. And as far as I can tell, it's kind of stabilized now. So our January 6th just happened there the last month. So that's kind of an interesting fact. Now, they're a pretty stable country overall, so they'll probably be fine, kind of like we are. But in these countries, in these other realms, stuff like that can go sideways really quickly if enough people get involved. So it sounds like right now they stabilized it, they took care of it. So keep your eye on the knees on that and see if anything else happens. And again, I'm already running more time than I wanted to, so I'm going to let you kind of check out these things in your textbook. It's divided into subregions. Sao Paulo used to be the capital. It's the biggest city. They actually constructed a city, Brasilia is the capital, and they actually planned and built that city from scratch. It wasn't like a city that kind of just started growing and over time got bigger and bigger. They actually engineered that city and made it a large city back several decades ago. So, and this just kind of tells you about the different regions and the agricultural practices and the minerals. Again, they have a lot of minerals. They have a lot of biological diversity, a lot of minerals, a lot of very fertile territory. It's just they really need to learn how to manage it correctly. I'm just kind of reading through this to see if there's anything else I want to mention about this before we cut it off. That's the Brasilia 1960. It's called a Ford Capital, which means they intentionally moved it and engineered it to a certain area. They wanted to populate a different part of the country. And this is just the Amazon basin. You can see it goes into Peru and up into this area. In Colombia, southern Venezuela. And that's it. So I was a little bit quicker this time. So again, anything y'all need, just let me know. I think everybody's keeping up with their assignments pretty well. If you're behind, remember to contact me before you don't turn something in and let me know that you're having an issue or it's going to be late, so we can take care of that, and I'll work with you on that. I need to grade some homework assignments. I know I need to get on that right after I get through with this video. And again, anything y'all need, just let me know. Thanks.